Hi everybody, welcome to week 3. And I think I owe you guys this week because last week I talked for nearly an hour on the lecture, and I don't intend to do that this week. This lecture is going to be quite a bit shorter because I want you to really focus on the readings, which are Wilson and Goodnow. And I will tell you that those readings are hard to read. They're written in a writing style we're not accustomed to. So I just want to spend a little time on this lecture really bringing up some questions that I want you to think about as you look at Wilson and Goodnow. So first of all, I think you saw these slides before, but I want to reiterate this. It's really important to think about Wilson and Goodnow in context. You know, we often point to Wilson as the father of public administration. In some senses, that's true, although this work of his really wasn't famous at the time, as famous as it became later when he was quoted as being the father of public administration. Goodnow actually expanded on what Wilson had to say, and what he expanded on was this notion of a politics-administration dichotomy. And so what do we mean by this idea, the politics-administration dichotomy? And we talked about this before, but what Wilson was saying was that administrative questions aren't political questions. He says politics sets the tasks for administration, but it's not allowed to manipulate the offices. In other words, he very much saw administrators as the servants of the politicians in a sense, but he also saw them as neutral and separated from the politicians. That politics itself was something of a kind of a rough and tumble or a dirty endeavor, right? So politicians engage in all kinds of behavior like compromising. They end up with policies that actually can be workable in spite of all that, but it required someone who was neutral to be able to do that. And so he also believed in this second quote that administration should be businesslike. Whatever he meant by businesslike, he meant that businesses were, conducted in a kind of in a rational, unemotional way. Whether that's true or not, that's what he meant to say. And Goodnow really re-emphasized what Wilson was saying, that a large part of administration is unconnected with politics. That is, it endures, it goes on in spite of whoever is in the office of president, whoever's elected in the House of Representatives or the Senate. Administration is going on continuously. And then Goodnow also actually goes beyond Wilson in the sense that he talks about state and local governments. And then finally, Wilson said, or Goodnow said, that we should actually find administration as analogous of the judiciary. And here he's talking about that we should have a more or less permanent civil service, as we have more or less a permanent judiciary. Most judges, especially judges in the federal court system, serve for a long time, typically for life until they retire. And so that's the analogy he's making. So let's talk about just a few points that Wilson and Goodnow are making in these writings. So where was Wilson coming from? This quote right here really says what the context he saw when he wrote in 1887, and that was he was writing in the wake of the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. So the Pendleton Act really did away with, in a very large part, the so-called spoils system, whereby people were appointed to federal offices based on their loyalty to the political party of the president who was elected. And so Wilson said, hey, look, we've we've been successful. We've reformed the personnel part of federal service. Now we need to reform the organizations themselves. And so Wilson very much is a reformer, and he believed that the Constitution was uh, incomplete in a sense that it really didn't lay out the way government should be administered. So here's some key points that Wilson makes. First of all, he says there should be a science of administration. I mean, this is what he calls it, a science of administration. And we're going to see that this term really persists for a long, long time. We don't use it as much anymore, but the term science of administration really was the term that was in favor for a good 50 years, right up until the end of World War II. Um, and so this view is really a repudiation of the Jacksonian view of the spoils system, that anybody can be an administrator, that really the only qualification you need is loyalty. And so Wilson claims that this hadn't been considered before. Why? Because most American political leaders had been concerned with actually forming the Constitution, forming the state. So the big concern from the constitutional era forward was the principles of American statehood, not the practicalities of American statehood, if you will. And so he said this in this way: the question was always who shall make the law and what shall that law be? The other question, how law should be administered with enlightenment, with equity, with speed, and without friction, was put aside as a practical detail which clerks could arrange after doctors had agreed upon principles. So what he was saying was constitution making in the United States had been a rather philosophical, high-minded affair, and the discussion was on principles, but it wasn't on mundane practicalities. And so when you get into the essay more, what you find is that Wilson really uses the European states, in particular the French and the Germans, as exemplars of how he thought administration should be run. And particularly in the case of the Germans, and if you think of the Prussian states, what he claims is that the Prussian monarchs, yes, they were absolute rulers, but they were also quite fond of and adept at administration. So they were good at setting up organizations to carry out their dictates. And they trained an entire corps, really. There was a Prussian bureaucracy that was dedicated to administration. And so this leads to this idea that administration is a field of business, that we should strive for efficiencies, that we should have trained persons in the profession, that we should promote these persons, and that we should separate these persons from politicians. And so going back to this idea of the philosophy of government, what he's really saying is that the American tradition needs to move on past the English tradition now, and quit focusing so much on lawmaking and curbing the power of kings. Quit worrying about that and start worrying about efficiency. And so both Wilson and Goodnow, to repeat, believed that politics and administration can be separated. And so Wilson's ideal state would be one where elected officials would develop sound policy, and administrative experts trained in the field of administration would be charged with coming up with the most effective methods of implementing policy. And this is where, in his essay, he comes up with this famous knife sharpening analogy, whereby the knife is a tool and you can learn to sharpen it even from a murderer. It's just a tool. And so, in effect, in this system, administrators, even though they're experts, they become something of instruments themselves, but they are separated from what he believed were the more unsavory aspects of politics. So let's switch gears to Goodnow real quick. Probably even more than Wilson, he firmly advocated this idea of a politics and administration dichotomy. And he gets to some points in his chapters there where he says, basically, both administrators and elected officials, that is, legislators, presidents, mayors, anyone else, um, are charged with supporting the Constitution. It's just that one is charged with making laws and one is charged with implementing laws. So legislators and city council members and legislators at the state level worry about the expression of the will of the state, and the other worries about the execution of that will. So a problem, with constitutional design is that lawmakers are political persons and attached to political parties. And so therefore, what he finds is that, we needed a strong party system really to act as something as an administrative branch, um, especially under the spoils system. So if a president, for example, is changing out every executive level office, appointed office, every 4 years, then it's really incumbent upon the party system to have a controlling influence on how the law is carried out. But in spite of that, we find that the spoils system failed because it did, in fact, often result in unqualified office holders. And so Goodnow is very much an advocate and a proponent of the Pendleton Act. He thinks the Pendleton Act is an excellent innovation because it provides that level of expertise that he thinks is necessary to run government. So he also encourages administrative centralization. Why does he do that? He does that because he believes in efficiency. And so he thinks that administrative decentralization is desirable not only at the federal level, but at state levels as well. And so civil servants in this kind of system should be treated as something akin to a judiciary. And so if you think of the court system, we think of independence of the court system, independence from lawmakers, independence from the executive. They're not bound by loyalty to presidents or governors. They're not bound by loyalty to legislators. Now, it is true that they're appointed by presidents and confirmed by legislators. But in a very real sense, because of their term of office, judges can outlive that connection. And they don't have to be bound by any kind of loyalty as a legislator would. And so his view is that civil servants can actually be treated in this same way. Well, okay, there's certainly some problems with what Wilson and Goodnow both have to say. One of the problems, Wilson himself actually, and this is John Rohr who points this out in some of his works, but Wilson himself really was not fond of our separation of powers system. He was really, in a previous work he wrote in 1885 called Congressional Government, he had actually called for a constitutional amendment which would have allowed members of the House and members of the Senate to hold executive level offices. Well, so what would that result in? That would actually result in parties forming shadow governments. So, in other words, if you got elected to the House of Representatives and your portfolio was foreign relations, then you might get appointed to an office in the State Department, or you might get appointed Secretary of State. And this would really result in exactly the kind of system that is carried out in Britain. It's not that it's undemocratic, it's just not what the constitutional design was. But in this system, we would have legislative supremacy, and basically the president would be more of a top administrator. And the will of the state would be carried out through the legislature, and the administrators would be carrying that out as a professional civil service. So the second problem is, if we speak of a politics-administration dichotomy, the first thing we have to do is define these terms, politics and administration, right? So politics is a word that gets kicked around a lot, and it's a word like art, isn't it? I mean, what is art? So what is politics? People like to use this shorthand that, well, it's politics as usual. And then in the conversation there, as if they really said something, but what did they really say? I mean, are we talking about electoral politics where people are running for office and, you know, making promises, for example, or slinging mud at their opponents? Are we talking about uh, the actual act of policymaking? That is, people who are elected putting their heads together inside the chambers of the legislature and trying to come up with workable policies. Are we talking about organizational politics in the administrative branch itself, for example? Are we talking about other things like family politics? Are we talking about uh, business politics? So the point is that the politics and all of its connected issues like power are really ever present among us. And so it's really difficult to define politics, but it's necessary if we're going to talk about something like a politics-administration dichotomy. And the second problem along those lines with definition of terms is administration the same at all levels? So is a civil servant, is an administrator doing the same job as a cabinet secretary, as a director of a high-level office, as a mid-level manager, as a low-level manager? Do they all have the same challenges? Is administration the same for all kinds of government functions? For example, military, agriculture, post office, patent office, all these things were offices that existed in Wilson and Goodnow's time when they were writing. And so that begs the question, are administrators, some administrators, more apt to become involved in politics than others are? And so getting to Goodnow, can we really make administration truly analogous to the judiciary? Is it desirable to have a completely independent administration vis-a-vis the judiciary? Does the level of government change the dynamic of the politics administrative dichotomy? I mean, if there's a dichotomy, does it look different at the national level than it does at the level of the city? Is that dichotomy different between the mayor and the parks department director than it is between, say, the president and someone who works in the EPA? Do unelected administrators have as much legitimacy in a constitutional republic as elected legislators? And for that matter, do unelected judges have as much legitimacy? Those are questions I want you to actually think about and struggle with. And if administrators work for the executive, how does the legislative branch provide oversight? So those are some problem areas that I kind of want you to dig into as you're writing the discussion this week. So this idea of an administration politics dichotomy, it's going to come up again and again and again. And it actually comes up in practical situations in organizations that you might work for. So this is one that really it's important to come to grips with your own thoughts about. And I'm not actually saying that there are wrong or right answers to it. What I am saying is that it's a real issue. It's an issue that Wilson and Goodnow both identified that continues to linger with us even, into 2017. So that's it. There's the blank slide. I promised this would be a shorter lecture. It is 30 minutes shorter. So I made my promise, and I'm looking forward to your answers on the discussion board. Thank you.